Hi guys, it's your friend Tony B again. It is April 6th, 2020, and this is Chapter 3, Part 2. As promised, the Beatles. So here we are in Chapter 3, and of course this comes with a YouTube playlist as well. Here we are at Chapter 3, page 11, and this nice little explanation of the Beatles here. Great. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr. There they are, the Silver Beatles. And next page has a picture of the Beatles with their original drummer, Pete Best. So for those of you who English may be your second language, obviously there's a pun on the word beat in the name of this band, right? And also the Beatles is an homage. Calling themselves the Beatles was an homage to Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Get it? And I always heard that was Stuart Sutcliffe, his idea, the original bass player. Again, you can read all about this group. I'm sure you have, and I'm sure you will, all over the internet machine and documentaries, etc. Very young when they met were Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Then came George Harrison, Stuart Sutcliffe, the original bass player who was best friends with John Lennon, and Pete Best, the original drummer. Early on, they were a really good bar band, and they definitely cut their teeth in the clubs, notably their 3 residencies in Hamburg, Germany, at some clubs including, let's see here, the Kaiserkeller. So in these days, they are working these clubs, hours a day, every day, and becoming a really good cover band. They do cover Little Richard songs, for example, Long Tall Sally with lead vocal by McCartney. They also cover a lot of Chuck Berry. Roll Over Beethoven is one with a lead vocal by George Harrison. They wind up covering a lot of tunes by Chuck Berry, a favorite for them, and other pop tunes and Broadway tunes as well. And listening to this band is fun because you kind of see how they go from the perfect, brill building style, Mercy beat pop band to the mind blowing album rock band that we know from their later days, propelled by the Beach Boys as well, as you know. So here on page 13 is this question: how popular were the Beatles in the U.S. charts? So that's April of 65, and you can see those are all the songs they had in the top 100, if that kind of thing means anything to you. So on page 14, there are some other truths here, the periods of the Beatles, early, etc., and other truths, I guess you'd say, some about their songwriting partnership, And then they go through the periods, the early, middle, late periods, and all this other information about the band. Some lyrics there. That song is on the list, Tomorrow Never Knows. Why is Sgt. Pepper so important? Indian music, this and that, up through page 18. So here's what I want you to do. Go through this playlist that I made for the YouTube and listen to these songs. The early period, part 1, I should say, early period part 1 is singles plus the first 2 albums, right? So the first album is Please Please Me, 1963. They're already a band for 3 years doing what they do, playing every single day, honing their skills. And I have a couple of songs on the list from this album, Love Me Do and Twist and Shout. Love Me Do is just listen to it. It's swing eighths, which is cool. Kind of, that means it's an older style of rock and roll. And great, almost like a double lead vocal from John and Paul. And again, guys, if you can listen to the entire albums of the Beatles, every album, straight down, be great. Twist and Shout is not a Beatles composition. It was written by Phil Medley and Bert Burns, and the famous recording is by the group the Isley Brothers, and the song's called Twist and Shout. Now, the story goes like this: the first album was done so cheaply and so quickly that they recorded it in less than one 24-hour period. So the idea is that by the end of the day, it was just such a long day of recording that Lennon's voice was just shot. Right? There's two stories. One is that he had a cold. The other, and the more believable one is the one I'm telling you, that it was just the end of the day. They had done so many tunes, probably a couple takes of one or the other, not sure exactly, and his voice is so shot by the end that what you get is what's on the record, which is him kind of barely making it a few times, but he's also completely going for it, you know. And this is rock and roll, people. There's 14 songs on this album. So now I don't think he was singing lead on every single tune, but still, that's a lot of work to do in one day. So anyway, that's that. The great, great version of Twist and Shout. Then we go to a couple songs from the second album, which is called With the Beatles, 1963 also. And another kind of swinging tune called All My Loving, which I want you to check out. Now, this is the story I would always tell in class, is that along the lines of the double tracked vocals thing, is that it seems to me that John and Paul sing the opening of this tune in unison together. So the effect is that of a double tracked, one person double tracking their vocals. The last verse of this tune, they split into harmony. Paul's on top, which is usually what happens. So, listen for that. And this is a jazzy piece, people. It is swing, and it features what they call a walking bass line. And it just reminds me of the fact that back in those days, even into the 60s, the line between jazz and pop and rock, rock and roll, I guess it was still at the time, it was kind of a blurred line. Not as clear. So that's that, All My Loving. And then the other tune I want you to listen to from this album, called Roll Over Beethoven, composed by Chuck Berry, with a lead vocal by George Harrison. Now we get to the early period, part 2, I call it, which is, and the reason I call it that is because it seems that since this is the first album, the third album, A Hard Day's Night, 1964, this is the first Beatles album to feature all original music. Every song on this album is written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. So, in my opinion, kind of early for that kind of situation. Other bands we talked about that stayed pretty cover heavy in the beginning, especially the Rolling Stones. So that's something to think about. By the third album, writing all their own music. And the songs we're going to listen to, A Hard Day's Night, actually just one song is on the list from this album, A Hard Day's Night. And I consider this a very good example of actual co-writing by John and Paul within the same piece of music. Because as we know, the later it went, the more it was just cats bringing in their own tune, John would bring in his own tune, Paul would bring his own tune, but it would still be credited to both of them, as per their deal as young songwriters. So then we go to, so that's A Hard Day's Night. Then we have, technical difficulties here, Beatles for Sale, which the tune that we're going to listen to from here is called, I think we were going to listen to the tune 8 Days a Week. So Beatles for Sale, also from 1964. This piece, 8 Days a Week, is another jazzy kind of piece with swing, rhythm, swing eighth notes. And always be listening for the evolution of this band if you can, you know, what they built on, where they're headed. Now, the next album is called Help, released in 1965. Oh, by the way, guys, don't forget that 1964 is the year that the Beatles play the Ed Sullivan Show and become overnight sensations, big old stars in the United States and beyond. And please check out those videos if you feel so inclined. So then the next album, Help, 1965, and the songs we're going to listen to from this album are the song Help, composed by John Lennon, and the song Yesterday, composed by McCartney. Now, on the song Help, I think you can hear both lyrically and just harmonically the growth in style, composition style of John Lennon. More of an adult theme. And you can see parallels with the Beach Boys, I think, through this period as well. So that's Help by John Lennon, and then Yesterday, composed by Paul McCartney. And this is the song that features McCartney playing acoustic guitar and singing, and no other Beatles present. A string ensemble that provides the rest of the instrumentation. Now, the name of the man who was the Beatles' producer is named George Martin. Only died within the past 5 years, I want to say. And they call him the fifth Beatle because he was one of those old school producers that could run a tape machine, but also was a good piano player and a good arranger. And he arranges the lion's share, more than 95% of the Beatles stuff that is orchestrated or has any other instruments on it is his arrangement. And he wrote the string arrangement to this piece Yesterday. So that's George Martin, regarded as another great producer, up there with Phil Spector and Brian Wilson in the rock music world anyway. So now we get to the middle period with the album, you know, and I think it even says it on page 15 of your book, musecitrusmuse.com. So we're in the middle period now, and the album is called Rubber Soul. And if you remember, this album is mentioned by Brian Wilson as his real kind of inspiration for Pet Sounds. So Rubber Soul was released in 1965, and I think everyone agrees, and you're going to hear some growth in all those areas that we talk about, especially in just the instrumentation and other influence from other styles of music. So the pieces we're going to listen to are Norwegian Wood and In My Life. Norwegian Wood features the instrument sitar, which is an Indian instrument. This is a very early usage of that instrument in pop or rock music. And just influences from outside influences, other countries, other ethnic groups, other music. In My Life, written by John Lennon, and a lovely little tune, also features a piano solo by George Martin. And if you would like to look up a video about how that was done, very interesting. Like I said, this album heavily influences Brian Wilson. And I think it expanded his mind into thinking, what could I do? You know, what could he do? And of course, we know Pet Sounds is the result. The other album from the so-called middle period is Revolver from 1966, so same year as Pet Sounds. And this is kind of the album, to me anyway, that you can really hear them leaning towards what they were headed for, which was Sgt. Pepper's, right? And the songs that are on the list from this album are Eleanor Rigby, which is another piece that features no Beatles playing an instrument. John and Paul sing on it, and a string ensemble. I want to say it was double quartet, again arranged by George Martin. And this is one of those spots where kind of really hear the storytelling abilities of these guys' lyric writing. So, a famous song, Eleanor Rigby. Then one of my personal favorites, and the final song on this album is called Tomorrow Never Knows. The funny story that you may have heard about how Ringo was notorious for coming up with quirky song titles. Never the song, just the title. And this was apparently one title that Lennon liked and made a song around. And this is kind of a really ear-opening piece, if you will, because I think it obviously makes great strides in production. Again, with the exotic instruments like sitar and just interesting sonic landscapes. Also backwards guitar on this one. So that was kind of all the rage back in the mid 60s. So backwards guitar, and I think it just makes it sound psychedelic. You tell me. And a song like Tomorrow Never Knows, I hear really leading towards what they did on the next album, which, of course, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So now we're in what they call the late period. And you know what? This album really is kind of the crux of this genre and this class, to be honest with you, because it seems like everything before it leads up to it, and everything after it is chasing it. So, and everything after it is definitely influenced by it and this band. So, please read at least the Wikipedia article on this album. And if you can, watch a documentary would be good too. 1967. So we've come from where we started in this class. We've come through all the groundwork music that we listened to, and rock and roll up to this point was basically about singles for the most part. With Pet Sounds and some other albums, and Rubber Soul and Revolver, it gets into more of a album as a work of art thing. But this album is the one that codifies the entire thing. The entire album is one long work of art. It was conceived that way, and that's how it's perceived. So sad that we're not together, because this is one of those albums that we would listen to the entire thing as a group together. And I'm asking you to do that now as well. So this is the whole point, people. The great works of art in music throughout history have been in this kind of thing. 45 minutes to an hour of the composer saying, I bet I can hold your attention for this time span. And then they have to create a piece that can either do it or not. And whereas the symphonies of Beethoven were usually in 4 movements, these albums are in 2, basically, right? Side 1 and side 2. And this album, it really expands on so much on what could be done as a rock record. So many different styles accounted for here, and diverse styles too, because there's a heavy Indian Eastern influence piece on here, and a lot of other things, Americana, and just some great straight up rock tunes as well. So enjoy this album, people, if you never have heard it before, and if you have heard it before, please enjoy it again. Like I said, it's the kind of the apex of this whole thing, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion. So, after Sgt. Pepper's, we have, see how quickly I can get through the rest here. After Sgt. Pepper's, we have Magical Mystery Tour, released as they call it a double EP, as opposed to an LP. So, and, go Google it if you care to. So, the song I want you to listen to from this album is called I Am the Walrus, and this is a John Lennon composition. Super great and super experimental. And you can read all about, what different stuff they did and tuning in the radio and all that great stuff and backward stuff and everything. This one has a fake fade out at the end, which is fun. And of course, supposedly this is where, right at the end, near the fade out section, where John Lennon says, I buried Paul. If you care to find it, it's in there. You'll never unhear it though. And then I heard in interviews John Lennon say that he merely was saying the words cranberry sauce. So you be the judge. Another song, since I am a trumpet player, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this piece, Penny Lane, composed by Paul McCartney. The man's name playing the piccolo trumpet solo is David Mason, and he was with whatever London orchestra at the time. So enjoy those. Then, of course, we have the White Album. Now, this is where the Beatles really got into working separately and then kind of bringing in their own tunes or working as pairs. McCartney and Ringo would make a couple. John and Paul would make some. George would make one with Ringo, whatever, this and that. So, and it's a double album, and it's great. And I implore you to listen to the whole thing. But the tunes we're going to listen to are Back in the USSR, which is how the album starts, the very first song. And this is just kind of obviously a send-up, a loving one, albeit of the Beach Boys, kind of like making fun of their style a little bit. And such a ridiculous, premise to do that style, if you think about it. And then another great song, this is composed by George Harrison, called While My Guitar Gently Weeps, right? With great lyric and great everything. Kind of a real heavy song, but this features lead guitar work by his best friend, Eric Clapton. So enjoy that. And of course, you know what happened to them. Clapton wound up marrying the woman that Harrison was married to. And they all stayed friends, so mazel. Then we have Yellow Submarine. White Album is 68, by the way. Yellow Submarine, 69. The soundtrack from the cartoon movie, and half of the album is, as far as I know, some orchestral music composed by George Martin. Soundtrack for the film. And the song we're listening to is called Yellow Submarine by Lennon McCartney with lead vocal. Credited to Lennon McCartney with lead vocal by Ringo, which is always fun. Then we get to what I call the later period part 2. And this is Let It Be and Abbey Road. Now, they're recorded in that order and released in the opposite order. So the point is that the last album to be recorded by the Beatles is Abbey Road. But the last album to be released by the Beatles is Let It Be, which was recorded earlier and kept in the can for a year, right? So that's why Let It Be is released in 1970 and Abbey Road is released in 1969. So we'll talk about Let It Be first. It's recorded almost completely before anything from Abbey Road was recorded, with a short overlap. And this is the album that is not the one Beatles album not produced by George Martin. It is produced instead by their rock and roll hero, Phil Spector. And it is an anomaly in their list of albums for that reason. Interestingly enough, this album years later was released. They called it Let It Be Naked, and it was released without the the orchestrations of Phil Spector, and that part of the production was just left out. It's just the band tracks. But anyway, the way it was released back in the day is with all this kind of wall of sound style orchestration by Phil Spector, who everyone adored and they revered him highly. That's why he's on this project. But if you listen to the Beatles talk about it, it wasn't really a fun time. It wasn't a fun project to work on. Still, though, every song is great on this record. So that's that. Then we have finally Abbey Road, which is their last album that they recorded together. And it's also, on a personal note, my favorite Beatles album, because I love the way it feels like they, for the second, as everyone knows, the second side of this album is kind of one long song that just goes right, no stopping. And it just feels like a nice triumphant way to go out, and they really got back together and did it like brought the spirit of their early days to this record, in my opinion. And the songs we have are Come Together, the very first song on the album, composed by John Lennon, and the song Something, which is composed by George Harrison, also one of several pieces, sidebar, one of several pieces to be composed about this woman, Pattie Boyd, who is the wife at the time of George Harrison. Later on, she marries Clapton. The song by Eric Clapton called Layla, which was recorded by the group Derek and the Dominoes, is also about this woman, Pattie Boyd. So that's that. But the albums I would love for you to listen to in their entirety are Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Abbey Road, if you can. So I guess that's it. This is the band that really influences every group that came after them, every rock group that came after them for sure, and other genres as well. You know, they transcend genre, these guys. And then, of course, they go on to make great solo albums after they split up in 1970. Not a great amicable split, but I think they patched things up a little bit later on. The solo albums are so fascinating to listen to. All Things Must Pass by George Harrison, for sure. And then, of course, John Lennon dies in 1980. Shot, murdered outside his apartment in New York City. And then George Harrison dies sometime later. Can I find that information for you? George Harrison died in 2001, it looks like. And of course, McCartney and Ringo are still around, and hopefully they'll still be around. So I apologize for the length of this video, but I hope you guys at least find the time to listen, watch, listen, and enjoy. So take care, my friends.